We never know which moments will shape our entire lives until we look back and see the thread that connected everything. For 8-year-old Clara, that moment came on a cold morning when she found a shivering dog in the woods and decided to build him a shelter. She used old boards and her small hands to create a simple home beneath the trees. She called him Scout and thought she was just helping a lonely animal. But Scout became her closest friend through childhood, her comfort during her parents' divorce, and her faithful companion through every season of growing up. Years passed, and life took Clara far from those woods, but Scout remained in her heart even after he was gone. Now at 53, Clara returns to her grandparents' old cottage, feeling lost after her daughter leaves for college. The little shelter still stands where she built it decades ago, weathered but strong. What Clara doesn't know is that this homecoming will reveal something about love and loyalty that will change everything she thought she understood about that little girl and her dog. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1980 painted the world in shades of amber and rust, but 8-year-old Clara Mitchell saw everything through a lens of confusion and sadness. Her parents' voices carried through the thin walls of their suburban home each night, sharp words cutting through her dreams like broken glass. Divorce, a word that tasted bitter on her tongue, had become the soundtrack of her young life. Every Friday afternoon, Clara's mother would pack a small suitcase with careful precision, folding Clara's clothes with the mechanical movements of someone going through practiced motions. "You'll have a wonderful time with Grandma and Grandpa," she would say, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The fresh air will do you good." The drive to her grandparents' cottage took 2 hours through, winding country roads that gradually shed the suburban sprawl for rolling hills and ancient oak trees. Clara pressed her face against the cool window, watching the landscape transform from strip malls and parking lots to weathered barns and stone fences that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Her grandparents, Henry and Margaret Whitmore, lived in a cottage that had belonged to Henry's family for 3 generations. It sat at the end of a gravel lane, surrounded by 70 acres of woods, meadows, and memories. The house itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the seasons, its white clapboard siding warmed by summer sun, its wraparound porch gathering autumn leaves, its windows glowing amber in the evening light. Grandfather Henry was a man of few words but deep kindness. His hands, gnarled from decades of farm work, could gentle a skittish horse or mend a broken toy with equal skill. He wore the same faded overalls every day, their blue denim softened by countless washings, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had learned that most problems solved themselves given enough time and grace. Grandmother Margaret moved through the cottage like a warm breeze, humming old hymns while she kneaded bread or tended her herb garden. She had a way of knowing exactly when Clara needed a hug or a cup of cocoa, appearing at just the right moment with flour-dusted hands and understanding eyes. Her silver hair was always pinned back in a neat bun, but strands would escape throughout the day, giving her a soft, approachable look that matched her gentle spirit. The cottage itself held magic in every corner. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and rising bread, with copper pots hanging from hooks and a cast-iron stove that radiated warmth even on the chilliest mornings. The living room featured a stone fireplace, large enough for Clara to stand in, its mantel lined with photographs spanning decades of family gatherings and celebrations. Upstairs, Clara's bedroom looked out over the backyard and into the woods beyond, where ancient trees created a canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained dappled with shadows. But it was those woods that called to Clara, with an almost mystical pull. Beyond the manicured lawn and Margaret's vegetable garden, a worn path disappeared into a tunnel of maple, oak, and pine trees. The forest seemed to whisper secrets in languages she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. On her first weekend at the cottage, Margaret had given her a gentle warning. Stay on the paths, dear one, and don't venture too far. The woods are beautiful, but they're bigger than they appear. Clara spent hours exploring the network of deer, trails and old logging roads that crisscrossed the property. She discovered a small creek that gurgled over smooth stones, its water so clear she could count the minnows darting between the shadows. She found clearings where wildflowers grew in profusion, their faces turned toward patches of sky visible through the canopy. She climbed trees whose branches formed natural seats, perfect for a small girl who needed time to think away from the complicated world of adults and their problems. The woods became her sanctuary, a place where her parents' angry voices couldn't reach, and where the word divorce held no power. Here she could be simply Clara, not the daughter caught between two warring parents, not the child who felt responsible for problems she couldn't understand or solve. In the cathedral quiet of the forest, she found a peace that had been missing from her life for months. It was during one of these woodland explorations that Clara discovered an old journal tucked beneath her bedroom mattress. The leather-bound book had belonged to her father when he was a boy, its pages filled with his careful handwriting, documenting fishing trips and adventures in these same woods. Reading his words, Clara felt a connection to a version of her father she had never known, a boy who loved nature and wrote with wonder about finding deer tracks and identifying bird calls. Inspired by his example, Clara began keeping her own journal. Each evening before bed, she would write about her day in careful 8-year-old script, documenting the creatures she had seen and the feelings she couldn't quite name. "The woods are different every day," she wrote one October evening. "Today I saw a red cardinal and 3 gray squirrels. I think the trees are getting ready for winter because their leaves are falling like confetti. I wish Mom and Dad could see how pretty it is here. Maybe they would stop being angry if they could walk in the woods with me." Her grandmother found her one evening, sitting cross-legged on her bed with the journal open on her lap, carefully drawing a picture of an oak leaf she had collected that day. Margaret settled beside her, the old bed creaking softly under their combined weight. "What are you writing about today, sweetheart?" Clara looked up, her brown eyes serious beyond her years. "I'm trying to remember everything, so I don't forget when I have to go home. Sometimes I pretend the woods go on forever and I never have to leave." Margaret's heart ached for this child who carried such heavy burdens in her small shoulders. She smoothed Clara's dark hair, noting how it had grown longer since the summer, and chose her words carefully. "You know, these woods have been here for over 100 years. They'll still be here when you're grown up, and they'll be here for your children someday. Some things endure, Clara. The love in this house, the beauty of these trees, the peace you find here, those things don't disappear just because you have to go away for a while." That night, Clara wrote in her journal with new purpose. "Grandma says the woods will always be here. I want to remember every path and every tree, so I can find my way back to the peaceful places. Tomorrow I'm going to explore the part of the forest I haven't seen yet. Maybe I'll find something special that belongs just to me." As autumn deepened, Clara's weekend retreats to the cottage became the anchor that kept her from drifting away entirely. During the long school weeks in town, she would close her eyes in the middle of math lessons or spelling tests and transport herself back to the forest paths. She could almost smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves and hear the gentle rustle of branches overhead. Her parents, lost in their own battles over custody arrangements and property division, barely noticed their daughter's growing attachment to the cottage. They saw only that she came back from her weekends calmer and less likely to ask difficult questions about when Daddy was coming home or why Mommy cried after phone calls with lawyers. But Clara was changing in ways that went deeper than surface calm. The woods were teaching her to observe, to listen, to find beauty in small things. She learned to identify bird calls and track animals through their footprints in the soft earth. She discovered which mushrooms grew after rain and how to tell the age of a tree by the texture of its bark. Most importantly, she was learning that she could be alone without being lonely, that solitude could be a choice rather than abandonment. The cottage and its surrounding forest were becoming more than a weekend escape. They were becoming home, in a way that transcended the temporary arrangements adults made. Here, Clara felt rooted and valued, understood in ways that didn't require words. Her grandparents provided the steady love and attention she craved, but it was the woods themselves that were shaping her spirit, teaching her lessons about patience, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from deep connections to place and purpose. As November approached and the trees stood nearly bare against grey skies, Clara sensed that something important was about to happen. She couldn't name the feeling, but it hummed in her chest like a tuning fork struck against stone. The woods felt expectant, as if they were holding their breath for something momentous. In her journal that week, she wrote words that would prove prophetic. I feel like the forest is waiting for something. Maybe it's waiting for me to find what I'm supposed to find. I hope I'm brave enough when the time comes. The first Saturday in November arrived wrapped in a biting wind that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oak trees and sent them skittering across the frost-touched ground. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of that wind rattling her bedroom windows, and something deep in her chest told her this day would be different from all the others. After breakfast, warm oatmeal with brown sugar and cream that Margaret ladled into her favorite blue bowl, Clara bundled into her thick coat and wool mittens. The cold bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the back porch, but the crisp air felt clean and full of possibility. She had planned to explore the far eastern section of the woods today, following a narrow deer path she had noticed the previous weekend, but hadn't yet had courage to investigate. The forest felt different in late autumn. Without their leafy canopy, the trees stood like cathedral pillars, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the pearl-grey sky. Clara's breath came in small puffs as she made her way along the familiar main trail, her boots crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves that rustled with each step. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard it. A sound so soft she almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through branches. It was a whimper, barely audible, coming from somewhere off the main path. Clara stopped, tilting her head to listen more carefully. There it was again, a sound of distress that made her heart clench with recognition. Following the sound required, leaving the marked trail, something her grandmother had specifically warned against. But the whimpering continued, growing slightly louder as Clara pushed through a tangle of bare elderberry bushes and stepped into a small clearing she had never seen before. What she found there would change everything. Huddled beneath a fallen log, shivering so violently that his entire body seemed to vibrate, was a dog unlike any Clara had ever seen. He was medium-sized, with a coat that might once have been golden, but was now matted and dulled by neglect. His ribs showed clearly through. His thin fur and one of his front paws was held at an odd angle, suggesting injury or pain. But it was his eyes that broke Clara's heart. Brown eyes filled with such profound sadness and resignation that she felt tears sting her own. The dog saw her approaching and tried to crawl deeper under the log, his whimpering intensifying. He was clearly terrified, expecting nothing good from human contact. Clara could see scratches and what looked like rope burns around his neck, signs of mistreatment that made her stomach turn with anger and compassion. "Oh, you poor thing," Clara whispered, dropping to her knees a safe distance away. "What happened to you?" The dog watched her warily, his body tensed for flight despite his obvious weakness. Clara could see he was trying to decide whether she represented safety or another source of pain. Something in his expression reminded her of her own reflection during her parents' worst arguments. That same combination of hope and fear, the desperate wish for comfort, coupled with the expectation of disappointment. Clara had no experience with rescued animals, but her instincts guided her actions. She sat perfectly still, speaking in the gentlest voice she could manage. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. You're safe now." For long minutes, they regarded each other across the small space, a frightened child and a broken animal, both seeking something they couldn't quite name. Gradually, Clara began to see subtle changes in the dog's posture. His shivering remained constant, but his ears, which had been pressed flat against his head, began to relax slightly. His eyes, while still wary, held a flicker of curiosity. "You must be so cold," Clara said, shrugging out of her thick winter coat. The November air bit through her sweater immediately, but she ignored her own discomfort. Moving very slowly, she extended the coat toward the dog, not trying to touch him, but offering the warm garment as a gift. The dog stared at the coat, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His nose twitched, taking in Clara's scent, and something in his expression shifted. With painful slowness, he crept forward just enough to nose the edge of the coat. The wool still held Clara's body heat, and the dog's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed his face into the fabric with a sound that was half whimper, half sigh. "That's right," Clara murmured, her heart breaking with joy and sorrow in equal measure. "It's warm, isn't it? You can have it. It's yours now." As the dog huddled under her coat, Clara's mind raced with practical concerns. He needed food, water, medical attention, and most urgently, proper shelter. The nights were growing colder, and without protection he wouldn't survive much longer. Looking around the small clearing, Clara began to see possibilities where others might see only obstacles. The fallen log that had been his inadequate refuge could serve as one wall of a proper shelter. Several sturdy saplings grew nearby, their trunks straight and strong. If she could find enough fallen branches and maybe some old boards from her grandfather's workshop, she could build something weatherproof and warm. "I'm going to build you a house," Clara announced, as if the dog could understand her plan. "A real house, just for you. I'll make it warm and safe, and I'll come visit you every day. Would you like that?" The dog's response was to press closer to her coat, and Clara took that as agreement. She had never built anything more complex than a pillow fort, but determination burned in her chest like a small, fierce flame. This abandoned creature needed her help, and she would not fail him. Rising carefully to avoid startling the dog, Clara began to gather materials. The forest provided an abundance of fallen branches, and she selected the straightest and strongest ones, creating a pile near the dog's hiding spot. She worked steadily, pausing frequently to offer reassuring words to her new friend, who watched her every movement with growing interest. When she had collected enough branches to form a basic framework, Clara realized she would need tools and additional materials from the cottage. The thought of leaving the dog alone made her chest tight with worry, but she had no choice. "I have to go back to the house for a few minutes," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to get some rope and maybe some old boards from Grandpa's workshop, and food. You must be so hungry. I'll be as quick as I can, I promise." She started to retrieve her coat, then stopped. The dog was still shivering, and the warmth seemed to be helping. Clara made her decision immediately, tucking the coat more securely around the frightened animal. "Keep it," she said simply. "I'll get another one from the house." As she prepared to leave, Clara noticed a piece of old rope tangled in the bushes nearby. It was frayed and dirty, clearly discarded, but it gave her an idea. Working carefully, she fashioned a simple collar from the cleanest section of rope, just large enough to fit around the dog's neck without being tight. "Every dog needs a collar," she said, gently slipping it over his head. The dog allowed this touch, perhaps recognizing it as a gesture of care rather than control. "And every dog needs a name. I think I'll call you Scout because you're out here exploring the woods just like me." Scout, for that's who he was now, officially and forever, looked at Clara with something approaching trust in his eyes. It was the beginning of everything, though neither of them could have imagined the decades of love and loyalty that would grow from this moment of connection in a cold November clearing. Clara ran back through the woods, faster than she had ever moved before, her heart pounding with urgency and purpose. She had found her calling in the most unexpected way, and she would not let Scout down. Behind her, the dog she had named settled more deeply into the borrowed warmth of her coat. His eyes fixed on the path where she had disappeared, already waiting for her return. Clara burst through the cottage's back door with the energy of a small hurricane. Her cheeks flushed red from cold and excitement. Margaret looked up from her knitting, immediately sensing the change in her granddaughter's demeanor. There was something different about Clara, a purposeful intensity that hadn't been there at breakfast. "Grandma, I need rope and some boards and food and maybe some old blankets," Clara announced breathlessly, already pulling open kitchen cabinets to search for suitable provisions. Margaret set down her knitting needles and studied Clara's face, with the careful attention of someone who had raised 5 children and knew when something significant was happening. "Slow down, sweetheart. What exactly do you need these things for? I found a dog in the woods. He's hurt and cold and scared, and he needs a proper shelter before tonight or he might die." Clara's words tumbled over each other in her urgency. "I already started collecting branches, but I need better materials to make it strong enough for winter." Henry, who had been reading his newspaper by the fireplace, lowered the pages and fixed his granddaughter with a measured look. "A dog, you say? Wild dog or somebody's pet?" Clara considered this question seriously. "He has rope marks on his neck like somebody kept him tied up and treated him badly, but he's not wild. He's just scared. His name is Scout." "You named him already?" Margaret's voice held a mixture of concern and affection. "He needed a name. Every living thing needs a name." Clara's matter-of-fact statement carried a weight that surprised all 3 of them. Henry folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "Show me this dog, Clara. If he's injured, we need to assess the situation properly." The walk back to Scout's clearing took 15 minutes, with Henry carrying a toolbox and Clara practically vibrating with nervous energy. She had wrapped herself in an old jacket of her grandfather's, but she kept glancing ahead anxiously, worried that Scout might have wandered away, or worse, collapsed from exhaustion and cold. But Scout was exactly where she had left him, still huddled under her coat. When he saw Clara approaching, his tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of joy Clara had seen from him. Henry's expression softened immediately at the sight of the bedraggled animal. "Well, I'll be," Henry murmured, crouching down to Scout's level but maintaining a respectful distance. "Somebody certainly did a number on you, didn't they, boy?" Scout's reaction to Henry was cautious but not fearful. Perhaps he sensed the same gentle strength that Clara had always found comforting in her grandfather. Henry extended his hand slowly, palm down, allowing Scout to catch his scent. After several long moments, Scout stretched his neck forward just enough to sniff Henry's fingers. "He's dehydrated and malnourished, but his eyes are clear and alert," Henry observed, with the practical assessment of someone who had cared for farm animals his entire life. "That front paw concerns me. Could be sprained, or he might have stepped on something sharp. We'll need to get Doc Morrison to take a look at him." Dr. James Morrison was the local veterinarian, a long-time friend of Henry's who served both farm animals and pets throughout the county. Clara's heart leaped at the suggestion that Scout might receive professional care. In the meantime, Henry continued standing and surveying the clearing with a builder's eye. "Let's see about this shelter you have in mind." What followed were the most purposeful hours of Clara's young life. Under Henry's patient guidance, she learned to select the straightest branches for the frame and how to lash them together with rope to create a structure that would stand up to wind and weather. Henry contributed weathered boards from his workshop, pieces of lumber that had been seasoned by decades of storage and were perfect for this unexpected purpose. Together, they built Scout his house. It wasn't large, perhaps 4 feet square and 3 feet high, but it was solidly constructed with a slanted roof to shed rain and snow, and a raised floor to keep Scout dry, even if water pooled in the clearing. Henry showed Clara how to weave smaller branches between the frame members to create walls that would block wind while still allowing air circulation. Scout watched their progress with growing interest, occasionally standing to inspect their work with the air of a discerning homeowner. Clara found herself narrating their activities to him, explaining each step as if he were her construction partner rather than simply the beneficiary. Now we're adding the roof boards, Scout. See how Grandpa angles them so the rain will run off? And tomorrow I'm going to bring some of that waterproof tarp from the barn to make sure you stay completely dry. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret appeared at the edge of the clearing carrying a basket laden with supplies. She had prepared a meal for Scout: warm beef broth, leftover pot roast cut into small pieces, and a bowl of fresh water. There were also several old towels and a worn but clean blanket that she had deemed suitable for outdoor use. Scout's reaction to his first real meal in what must have been weeks was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. He ate with the desperate efficiency of an animal who had learned never to take food for granted, but he paused frequently to look up at Clara as if seeking permission to continue. She sat nearby, speaking to him in gentle tones and gradually moving closer as he became more comfortable with her presence. By late afternoon, Scout's shelter was complete and furnished with the blankets Margaret had provided. The little house looked sturdy and welcoming, a far cry from the exposed log where Clara had first found him that morning. But the real transformation was in Scout himself. Clean water and good food had already begun to restore some of his strength, and his coat, though still matted, had regained a hint of its natural golden color. Most remarkably, Scout had begun to show signs of personality. When Clara praised his new house, his tail wagged with genuine enthusiasm. When Henry offered him a gentle scratch behind the ears, Scout leaned into the touch with a contented sigh. And when it came time for the humans to return to the cottage for dinner, Scout followed Clara to the edge of the clearing, watching her leave with obvious reluctance, but no longer cowering in fear. That night, Clara began creating what she privately called her Scout Care Manual. Using a composition notebook she had brought from home, she carefully drew diagrams of Scout's shelter and wrote detailed instructions for his care. She listed his favorite foods, documented his daily routine, and noted his gradual progress toward health and trust. Day 1 with Scout, she wrote in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. Built him a house today with Grandpa's help. Scout ate 3 bowls of food and drank lots of water. His tail wagged when I told him good night. I think he knows he's safe now. Tomorrow I will bring him breakfast and check his hurt paw. I promised him I would come back every day, and I always keep my promises. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Clara could hear the wind rattling the bare tree branches outside her window, but instead of feeling worried, she felt proud. Somewhere in those woods, Scout was spending his first night in a warm, dry shelter, protected from the elements and surrounded by evidence of human kindness. She had kept her word to him, and tomorrow she would continue proving that some promises are meant to last forever. November melted into December with a series of grey days that seemed designed for quiet contemplation and gentle healing. Clara's weekends developed a rhythm centered entirely around Scout's care and their growing friendship. Every Friday evening, she would arrive at the cottage with her small suitcase in one hand and a bag of special treats for Scout in the other. Every Monday morning, she would leave reluctantly, her pockets filled with smooth river stones they had collected together during their woodland adventures. Dr. Morrison had visited on Clara's second weekend with Scout, pronouncing the dog's paw. Injury minor, likely a thorn puncture that had become infected, but was healing nicely with proper care. More importantly, he had given Scout a clean bill of health overall, noting that despite his obvious mistreatment, the dog possessed a strong constitution and a resilient spirit. This fellow's got good bones and a good heart, the veterinarian had told Clara while Scout submitted to his examination with patient dignity. With regular meals and kind treatment, he'll be as strong as any dog in the county before spring arrives. Clara had taken these words as a sacred charge. She developed detailed routines for Scout's care that bordered on the ritualistic. Each morning began with breakfast, usually leftover meat from Margaret's table, supplemented with dry kibble that Henry had purchased specially. Clara would sit beside Scout's shelter while he ate, reading aloud from her library books or sharing stories about her week at school. Scout proved to be an excellent listener. He would settle beside Clara, with his head resting on his paws, his brown eyes fixed on her face with an attention that never wavered. When she read exciting passages from adventure stories, his ears would perk forward. When she shared her worries about her parents' ongoing divorce proceedings, he would move closer, sometimes resting his chin on her knee in a gesture of comfort that seemed almost human in its intentionality. These quiet conversations became Clara's emotional anchor during a time when her home life grew increasingly turbulent. Her parents' custody battle had escalated through the fall, with lawyers and court dates becoming the vocabulary of her everyday existence. At school, she struggled to concentrate on mathematics and spelling when her mind was preoccupied with adult concerns far beyond her understanding. But in the woods with Scout, Clara found peace that had been missing from her life for months. Here, the complicated world of divorce papers and custody arrangements held no power. Here, she was simply a girl with her dog, exploring the forest paths and learning the ancient rhythms of the natural world. Their adventures together revealed Scout's true personality as he recovered his health and confidence. He was naturally curious, investigating every new scent and sound with the thoroughness of a born explorer. He was gentle with smaller creatures, watching squirrels and birds, with interest but never aggressive pursuit. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand Clara's moods, with an intuition that bordered on the mystical, offering comfort when she was sad and sharing her excitement when she discovered something wonderful in their explorations. Together, they mapped the woods surrounding the cottage, following deer trails to hidden clearings and creek beds that seemed untouched by human presence. Clara began collecting special stones from their favorite spots, smooth river rocks, pieces of quartz that caught the winter sunlight, unusual formations that caught her eye. She kept these treasures in a wooden box in her bedroom, each one tagged with a note about where she and Scout had found it and what they had been doing that day. The collection grew steadily through December, becoming a physical record of their friendship. There was the heart-shaped stone from the morning Scout had finally allowed Clara to brush his coat. The piece of white quartz from the afternoon they had watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead for nearly an hour. The perfectly round pebble from the day Scout had chased his first butterfly, bounding through a meadow with puppy-like enthusiasm that had made Clara laugh until her sides ached. But their peaceful routine faced its first serious challenge just before Christmas, when Clara's parents reached a temporary custody agreement that would significantly reduce her time at the cottage. During a tense phone conversation that Clara overheard from her bedroom, her mother informed Margaret that Clara would be spending only one weekend per month at the cottage starting in January. The child needs stability and routine, her mother's voice carried clearly through the old house's thin walls. All this back and forth isn't healthy for her emotional development. The therapist thinks Clara is using these weekend trips to avoid dealing with the reality of the divorce, Clara felt. Something cold and hard settled in her stomach as she listened. The adults were discussing her life as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person with her own feelings and needs. Worse, they were talking about separating her from Scout just when their friendship had become the most important thing in her world. That night, she confided her fears to Scout, who listened with his usual patient attention as she explained the complicated world of adult decisions and their potential consequences. "I don't know what I'll do if I can only see you once a month," she whispered, her arms wrapped around Scout's neck as they sat together in his shelter. "You won't understand why I'm not coming every weekend. You'll think I forgot about you or stopped caring." Scout's response was to press closer to Clara, his warm body providing comfort even as her heart ached with anticipated loss. In that moment, Clara made a decision that would define much of what came next in their relationship. "I won't let them separate us," she said, with the fierce determination that sometimes surfaces in children when they encounter injustice they cannot accept. "I don't care what the lawyers say or what Mom thinks is best for my emotional development. You need me, and I need you. That's more important than custody schedules and therapy appointments." Over the remaining days of December, Clara began developing what she privately thought of as her resistance strategy. She documented every aspect of Scout's care routine, creating detailed instructions that would allow her grandparents to maintain his health during her absences. She stockpiled supplies in the cottage, extra blankets, toys, and treats that would help Scout feel loved even when she couldn't be there personally. Most importantly, she began teaching Scout that temporary separations didn't mean permanent abandonment. During her last weekend before the new custody arrangement took effect, Clara practiced leaving Scout for increasingly longer periods, always returning exactly when she promised. She wanted him to learn that her word was trustworthy, that when she said she would come back, she meant it absolutely. On her final night of unlimited access to Scout, Clara sat with him under the stars, both of them wrapped in an old quilt Margaret had provided. The December air was crisp and clear, and Clara could see her breath as she spoke. "No matter what happens with the grown-up decisions, you're my dog, and I'm your person," she told him solemnly. "That doesn't change because of custody agreements or therapy appointments. Some things are bigger than adult rules, Scout. Love is bigger than rules." Scout's tail thumped against the ground in agreement, and Clara took that as his promise to wait for her, no matter how long the intervals between visits became. 8 years had passed since that November morning when Clara first found Scout shivering beneath a fallen log, and both had grown in ways that reflected the patience and wisdom that comes with enduring love. Clara, now 16, stood nearly as tall as her grandmother, her childhood roundness replaced by the angular grace of approaching womanhood. Her hair, still the rich brown it had been as a child, now fell in waves past her shoulders, and her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences beyond her years. Scout had aged too, though gracefully. His golden coat, restored to full health through years of Clara's devoted care, now showed distinguished touches of grey around his muzzle and ears. At 8 years old, he moved with the measured dignity of a dog who had learned that security was not something to take for granted, but neither was it something to fear losing again. The cottage remained Clara's sanctuary, though her visits had indeed become less frequent as her parents' divorce settlement had dictated. One weekend per month seemed criminally inadequate to maintain the deep connection she and Scout shared, but they had adapted with the resilience that marks both devoted friends and determined hearts. Clara's relationship with her parents had grown increasingly strained as she entered her teenage years. Living primarily with her mother in town, she chafed against the suburban restrictions and social expectations that felt artificial after years of finding peace in the woods. Her grades remained excellent, but her teachers noted that she seemed distracted, often staring out classroom windows with the expression of someone whose heart resided elsewhere. Her mother, Janet, interpreted Clara's withdrawal as typical teenage rebellion and responded with increased structure and supervision. "You spend too much time alone with your thoughts," she would say, scheduling Clara for additional activities and social events that were supposed to provide healthy outlets for adolescent energy. But Clara found these organized pursuits hollow. Compared to her weekend adventures with Scout, school dances and shopping trips with classmates felt like performances she was expected to give rather than experiences she chose to embrace. The other girls her age seemed focused on concerns that struck Clara as trivial: which boys were dating which girls, what everyone was wearing to the spring formal, who said what about whom in the hallways between classes. It was during one of these mandatory social events, a birthday party for the daughter of her mother's friend, that Clara met David Hartwell. He was 17, a year ahead of her in school, with sandy brown hair and green eyes that seemed to actually see her rather than simply looking through her the way most of her peers did. David was different from the other boys at the party. While they clustered around the television playing video games or engaged in the kind of boastful conversation that seemed designed more to impress than to communicate, David sat apart, reading a paperback novel with the focused attention Clara recognized in herself. "What are you reading?" Clara asked, settling into the chair beside him with the boldness that sometimes surprised even her. David looked up, seeming genuinely pleased by the interruption rather than annoyed. "The Old Man and the Sea. It's for English class, but I actually like it. Hemingway understood something about solitude that most people miss." Clara felt a spark of recognition. Here was someone who might understand her own need for quiet spaces and genuine connections rather than the superficial socializing that exhausted her. They spent the rest of the party talking about books and dreams, discovering a shared love of stories that explored the deeper currents of human experience. When David asked if he could drive her home, Clara agreed with an excitement she hadn't felt about any social interaction in months. But as they pulled into her driveway, she found herself torn between wanting to continue their conversation and her automatic protective instinct about sharing the most important parts of her life. "Would you like to see something special?" she found herself asking, surprising them both. "I mean, not tonight, but maybe this weekend. There's a place that's important to me." David's smile was warm and genuinely interested. "I'd like that very much." That Friday afternoon, Clara found herself in the unusual position of being nervous about a visit to the cottage. She had never brought a friend to meet Scout, partly because her limited time there felt too precious to share, and partly because she wasn't sure how to explain the depth of her connection to a dog that others might see as simply a pet. But David's reaction to both the cottage and Scout exceeded her hopes. He greeted Henry and Margaret with the respectful attention that immediately won their approval, and when Clara led him into the woods to meet Scout, his response was everything she could have wished for. Scout, now mature enough to be selective, in his enthusiasm for strangers, approached David with cautious dignity, but something in the young man's patient manner and gentle voice earned Scout's approval. Within minutes, the three of them were walking the familiar forest trails together, David asking thoughtful questions about the woods and listening with genuine interest to Clara's stories about her years of exploration. "You're lucky to have found him," David said, watching Scout investigate an interesting scent near the creek bank. "Most people go their whole lives without a friendship that pure." Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude. Here was someone who understood without lengthy explanation, who recognized the value of what she and Scout shared. For the first time in months, she felt the possibility of having both worlds, her deep connection to Scout and the cottage, and a relationship with someone her own age who appreciated rather than dismissed what mattered most to her. But as spring turned to summer and her relationship with David deepened, Clara began to face a conflict she hadn't anticipated. David was planning for college, making decisions about his future that would take him hundreds of miles away. He spoke about their relationship with the casual assumption that Clara would naturally want to follow the same path. College in the fall, probably somewhere far from the rural county where she had found her deepest happiness. "You're too smart to waste your potential in a place like this," David said one afternoon as they sat by the creek with Scout dozing between them. "There's a whole world out there, Clara. Don't you want to see what else is possible?" Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach, a familiar sensation she remembered from childhood conversations about custody arrangements and what adults thought was best for her development. The assumption that her current life was somehow inadequate, that growth necessarily meant leaving behind the things and places and relationships that had shaped her most profoundly, sparked a defensive anger she struggled to articulate. "What if what's possible is right here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. What if the whole world is actually much smaller than people think, and the important thing is finding the part of it where you belong? David's expression grew concerned, and Clara realized that her response had revealed a fundamental difference in their perspectives that neither of them had fully recognized before. He saw the cottage and the woods as a pleasant retreat from real life, a nostalgic connection to childhood that would naturally be outgrown as she matured. She saw them as the foundation of everything authentic and meaningful in her existence. That night, Clara sat with Scout in his shelter, now reinforced and weatherproofed through several renovations over the years, and struggled with feelings she couldn't entirely name. She cared deeply for David, enjoyed his company, and appreciated his intelligence and kindness. But his vision of their future together required her to abandon the very things that had made her who she was. It was Scout who provided the clarity she needed, simply by being exactly who he had always been, faithful, present, and completely committed to their shared life in these woods. His love asked nothing of her, except that she continue to be herself. It demanded no sacrifices, required no abandonment of previous loyalties, and offered no judgment about her choices or potential. As summer deepened, and David's college plans solidified, Clara found herself facing the first major decision of her adult life. She could follow the path that everyone expected: college, career, a conventional future built on the assumption that progress meant leaving the past behind. Or she could trust the wisdom she had learned from 8 years of friendship with Scout. Wisdom that suggested some connections are too valuable to sacrifice for the sake of other people's definitions of success. That weekend, she found herself creating another wooden cross marker, this one for Scout's first neighborhood companion, an elderly collie named Rusty, who had passed away peacefully the previous month. As she carved Rusty's name into the pine board, Clara reflected on the lessons that surrounded her in these woods. Love was not something you outgrew or left behind in pursuit of bigger things. Love was the biggest thing, and everything else was simply decoration around its edges. The autumn of Clara's senior year arrived with an urgency that seemed to compress time itself. Each day weighted with decisions that would shape the rest of her life. College applications sat on her bedroom desk like unspoken accusations, their blank spaces demanding answers to questions she wasn't sure she wanted to ask. Her guidance counselor had scheduled multiple meetings to discuss her exceptional potential and the opportunities she would be foolish to waste. But every weekend at the cottage revealed changes in Scout that made Clara's future plans feel increasingly irrelevant. At 9 years old, he moved with a subtle stiffness that spoke of aging joints and the accumulated weight of years. His morning ritual of bounding from his shelter to greet Clara had evolved into a more measured approach, though his enthusiasm remained undimmed. His golden coat, still beautiful, now showed more grey than Clara cared to acknowledge, and sometimes she caught him sleeping more deeply than he had in previous years. Dr. Morrison, during his annual checkup visit, had been characteristically direct. Scout's in excellent health for a dog his age, but he's entering his senior years. No cause for immediate concern, but it's something to be aware of as you make your plans. Those words haunted Clara through the long school weeks between cottage visits. The thought of Scout aging while she was hundreds of miles away, pursuing a degree in subjects that felt abstract and disconnected from everything she truly valued, filled her with a anxiety that manifested as sleepless nights and distracted days. Her relationship with David had become another source of internal conflict. He had been accepted to Northwestern University and assumed Clara would apply to schools in the Chicago area so they could maintain their relationship. His excitement about their shared future was genuine and touching, but it required Clara to embrace a vision of herself that felt fundamentally foreign. "You could study veterinary medicine," David suggested during one of their weekend walks through the woods. "That way your love of animals could become your career. It makes perfect sense." Clara watched Scout investigating a fallen log with the methodical attention he brought to all his explorations, and felt a familiar disconnect between what others saw as logical progression and what her heart understood as true calling. "What if I don't want my love of animals to become my career?" she asked quietly. "What if some things are too important to turn into jobs?" David's expression grew concerned, a look she had seen more frequently as their graduation date approached. "Clara, you can't spend your whole life hiding in these woods. There's nothing wrong with loving this place, but you have too much potential to waste it on." He gestured vaguely at their surroundings, and Clara felt something sharp and protective rise in her chest. On what? On loyalty, on keeping promises, on being present for the relationships that matter most. Her voice carried an edge that surprised both of them. They walked in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, Scout seemingly oblivious to the tension as he padded along the familiar trails. Finally, David stopped and turned to face Clara directly. "I'm worried about you," he said with genuine care. "You're brilliant and kind and capable of anything you set your mind to, but you're making decisions based on a dog. That's not healthy, Clara. That's not how adults build meaningful lives." The word adults hung between them like a challenge, and Clara felt something shift in her understanding of their relationship. David saw her connection to Scout as immaturity, something to be outgrown rather than honored. He couldn't understand that Scout had been her teacher in loyalty, presence, and unconditional love, lessons that seemed far more valuable than anything she might learn in lecture halls or career planning sessions. That evening, Clara sat with her grandmother in the cottage kitchen while Margaret prepared dinner, and Scout dozed contentedly at Clara's feet. The familiar rhythm of Margaret's cooking, the chop of vegetables, the sizzle of butter in the pan, the comfortable sounds of a meal being prepared with love, provided a counterpoint to Clara's churning thoughts. "Grandma," Clara said finally, "how do you know when you're making the right choice about your future?" Margaret paused in her stirring and looked at Clara with the patient attention that had always made her feel heard and valued. "What does your heart tell you, sweetheart?" "My heart tells me that Scout needs me here, that this place is where I belong, that the life everyone wants me to choose would mean abandoning the most important relationship I've ever had." Clara's words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for months. "And what does everyone else tell you?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "That I'm being childish and limiting my potential and making decisions based on a dog, as if loving someone isn't the most important thing a person can do." Margaret turned from the stove and settled into the chair beside Clara, her flour-dusted hands folding gently in her lap. "Your grandfather and I chose to build our life here because this place shaped us, made us who we were meant to be. Some people need the energy of cities or the challenges of careers that take them far from home. Others need the constancy of place and the depth that comes from long relationships. Neither choice is right or wrong. They're just different paths. But everyone expects me to choose the first path. They think I'm wasting my life if I don't." Margaret reached over and smoothed Clara's hair with the same gentle gesture she had offered when Clara was 8 years old and wrestling with her parents' divorce. "The only life you can waste is your own, dear one, and you can only waste it by living according to other people's definitions of success rather than your own understanding of meaning." That night, Clara discovered a faded photograph tucked inside her childhood journal, a picture Margaret had taken the previous summer, of Clara and Scout sitting by the creek. In the image, Clara was laughing at something Scout had done, her face bright with genuine joy, while Scout gazed at her with the devoted attention that had been constant throughout their relationship. Looking at the photograph, Clara felt a clarity that had been missing from months of college planning and future discussions. The girl in the picture knew exactly who she was and what mattered most. The question wasn't whether Clara should honor that knowledge, but whether she had the courage to live according to its wisdom. She spent the rest of the weekend documenting everything about Scout's current routine and health, creating detailed notes that would help her grandparents monitor any changes during her absence. but for the first time in months, that absence felt temporary rather than permanent. She was beginning to understand that some promises transcend conventional definitions of adulthood, and that the most mature choice might be the one that honored the relationship that had taught her everything important about love, loyalty, and the strength that comes from deep commitment. The college applications remained blank on her desk, but Clara felt less guilty about their emptiness. Some decisions couldn't be forced according to external timelines, and some futures were worth waiting for until the path became clear. Clara had just finished her college graduation ceremony, the weight of her diploma both satisfying and strangely anticlimactic in her hands, when the phone call came that would change everything she thought she knew about her life with Scout. She had chosen to attend the state university just 2 hours from the cottage, a compromise that allowed her to visit Scout regularly while still pursuing the education everyone insisted she needed. The caller was Dr. Morrison, his voice carrying an unusual formality that immediately set Clara's nerves on edge. "Clara, I need to speak with you about Scout, not about his health. He's fine for his age. But there's something I think you should know, something I've been debating whether to share for many years." Clara felt her stomach drop. At 22, she had learned to recognize the tone adults used when they were about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her world. She had heard it during her parents' divorce, and she was hearing it again now. "What is it, Dr. Morrison?" she asked, settling onto her apartment's small couch and bracing herself for whatever revelation was coming. "I need you to come to my office tomorrow, if you can manage it. There are some things I need to show you, documents and photographs. That will explain a lot about how Scout came to be in those woods the morning you found him." The drive to Dr. Morrison's office the next day felt interminable, Clara's mind spinning through possibilities, none of which prepared her for what she actually discovered. The veterinarian's office was quiet on a Saturday afternoon, with only Dr. Morrison waiting for her in his small consulting room. On his desk sat a manila folder thick with papers and what appeared to be old photographs. "Clara, what I'm about to tell you might change how you understand your relationship with Scout, but I hope it won't change how you value it," Dr. Morrison began, his weathered hands folding over the mysterious folder. "Scout wasn't a stray when you found him that morning. He was placed in those woods deliberately by people who knew you would find him and who believed you needed him as much as he needed you." Clara stared at him, feeling as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis. "What do you mean, placed?" Dr. Morrison opened the folder and withdrew a photograph that made Clara's breath catch. It showed Scout as a younger dog, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, but his coat was glossy and healthy, and he was wearing a proper leather collar. He was sitting beside a small girl Clara didn't recognize, both of them smiling at the camera. Scout's original name was Buddy, and he belonged to the Henshaw family, who lived about 5 miles from your grandparents' property. Sarah Henshaw was 7 years old when this picture was taken, and Buddy was her closest companion, just as Scout became yours. Clara studied the photograph, seeing in Scout's younger face the same gentle intelligence and devotion she had always known, but directed toward a different child. The revelation felt like discovering that someone she loved had led an entire life before she met them, which she realized was exactly what had happened. "What happened to Sarah?" Clara asked, though something in Dr. Morrison's expression already suggested the answer would be difficult. Sarah died in a car accident when she was 8 years old. Her father was driving. There was black ice, no one's fault. Just one of those terrible tragedies that reshape entire families. Buddy was in the car too, but he survived with only minor injuries. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she imagined Scout's first experience with devastating loss, losing his beloved child companion in circumstances he couldn't understand or prevent. Dr. Morrison continued, his voice gentle but steady. After Sarah's death, her parents couldn't bear to keep Buddy. Everything about him reminded them of what they'd lost. But they also couldn't bear to simply give him to strangers. They knew he was grieving too, that he understood Sarah was gone and wasn't coming back. So they abandoned him? Clara's voice carried a sharp edge of anger. No, not exactly. Dr. Morrison withdrew another document from the folder, what appeared to be a letter written in careful longhand. Margaret Whitmore and Sarah's mother, Linda Henshaw, had been corresponding for months. Your grandmother had mentioned in her letters how much you were struggling with your parents' divorce, how you seemed lost and lonely despite their best efforts to comfort you. Clara felt the world shift again as the implications became clear. Grandma knew? Your grandmother and Linda Henshaw developed a plan together. They believed that Buddy needed a new child to love and protect, and that you needed exactly the kind of unconditional devotion that Buddy was capable of providing. But they also understood that the relationship would only work if it felt organic to you, if you chose it rather than having it imposed upon you. Dr. Morrison handed Clara the letter, written in her grandmother's familiar script. As she read, the careful orchestration of that November morning became clear. Linda Henshaw had brought Buddy to the woods near the cottage the night before Clara found him. Margaret had suggested Clara explore that particular section of the forest, knowing the injured dog would be there waiting. Even Buddy's condition had been carefully managed. He hadn't been truly abandoned or mistreated. His matted coat and thin appearance were the result of deliberate neglect designed to elicit Clara's compassion, while ensuring he remained healthy enough to recover quickly with proper care. "The arrow burns on his neck?" Clara asked, remembering her childhood fury at his apparent mistreatment. Stage makeup, applied by Linda Henshaw, who worked in community theatre. She wanted to ensure you would see him as needing rescue, that your protective instincts would be fully engaged from the first moment. Clara sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what she was learning. Everything she had believed about finding Scout, about their chance encounter and her spontaneous decision to help him, had been carefully orchestrated by adults who understood her emotional needs better than she had understood them herself. But as the initial shock faded, Clara found herself focusing on a different aspect of the revelation. Scout had chosen to love her, regardless of how their meeting had been arranged. His devotion over the past 14 years had been genuine and freely given. He had grieved for Sarah, but he had also opened his heart to Clara and become genuinely attached to their life together. "Why? Are you telling me this now?" Clara asked finally. Dr. Morrison's expression grew gentle. "Because Linda Henshaw passed away last month, and in her final letter to your grandmother, she asked that you be told the truth. She wanted you to know that Scout was Sarah's gift to you, passed along by mothers who understood that some kinds of love are too precious to die with the people who first experienced them." Clara drove back to the cottage in a daze, the folder of documents and photographs on the passenger seat beside her. When she arrived, she found Scout waiting in his usual spot on the front porch, his tail beginning its familiar, welcoming rhythm. As soon as he heard her car, looking at him now, Clara could see Sarah's influence in his perfect manners, his gentle way with smaller creatures, his intuitive understanding of human emotions. He had been shaped by his first child, trained in the art of devoted companionship, and then shared that expertise with Clara when she needed it most. That evening, as they walked their familiar forest trails, Clara found herself grateful rather than betrayed by the revelation. The adults in her life had conspired to give her exactly what she needed at exactly the moment she needed it most. Scout's love had been real from the beginning, even if their meeting had been arranged. As they sat beside the creek where they had spent countless hours together, Scout resting his graying head on Clara's knee, she understood that some gifts transcend the circumstances of their giving. Scout had been Sarah's dog first, but he had chosen to become Clara's dog completely. That choice, renewed daily for 14 years, was what mattered most. Not the careful planning that had brought them together, but the authentic love that had grown from that first engineered encounter. The revelation about Scout's origins had initially shaken Clara's understanding of their relationship. But as autumn settled over the cottage grounds, she found that knowing the truth had actually deepened rather than diminished what she felt for him. At 14 years old, Scout was moving into the twilight of his life with the same dignity he had brought to everything else. But the signs of his aging could no longer be ignored or dismissed as temporary. Clara had taken a position at the county's Animal Welfare Office immediately after graduation, a job that allowed her to work with rescued animals while staying close to the cottage. Her colleagues saw her decision to remain in their rural county as either lack of ambition or unwillingness to embrace adult responsibilities. But Clara had learned to trust her own instincts about what constituted a meaningful life. Her relationship with David had ended amicably during their senior year of college, both of them finally acknowledging that they wanted fundamentally different futures. He had moved to Chicago and was building exactly the kind of successful urban life he had always envisioned. From his occasional emails, Clara could tell he was genuinely happy, and she felt grateful that their parting had been gentle rather than bitter. But Scout's declining health was becoming impossible to ignore. His morning greetings, once explosive with joy, had become quieter affairs. He still wagged his tail when Clara arrived each weekend, but his movements were careful and deliberate, and she could see him thinking through physical actions that had once been automatic. His appetite remained good, and his eyes still held their familiar intelligence and warmth, but Dr. Morrison's most recent examination had confirmed what Clara's heart already knew. His kidneys are starting to show their age, and there's some arthritis in his hips and shoulders, Dr. Morrison had explained with the careful gentleness he reserved for difficult conversations. He's not in significant pain yet, but we're looking at months rather than years, Clara. I want you to be prepared. Clara had nodded, thanking him for his honesty while feeling something cold and hard settle in her chest. She had known this conversation was coming, had been dreading it for months, but hearing the words spoken aloud made Scout's mortality feel suddenly immediate and inescapable. That weekend, Clara made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She gave notice at her job and arranged to move back into her childhood bedroom at the cottage for what everyone understood would be Scout's final months. Her supervisor tried to dissuade her, arguing that she was making a mistake that could derail her career before it had truly begun. "You're 23 years old," her boss had said with well-intentioned concern. "You can't put your entire life on hold for a dog, Clara. That's not how responsible adults handle these situations." But Clara had learned to distinguish between other people's definitions of responsibility and her own understanding of loyalty. Scout had been present for every significant moment of her growing up. He had comforted her through her parents' divorce, celebrated her academic achievements, and waited patiently through her college years with unwavering faith in her return. The idea of him spending his final months wondering where she was felt like the deepest kind of betrayal. "He was there for me when I needed him most," Clara explained to her grandmother as they sat in the familiar cottage kitchen. "How can I be anywhere else when he needs me most?" Margaret's response was a soft smile and a gentle squeeze of Clara's hand. "Your grandfather would have done exactly the same thing," she said simply. "Some relationships are worth everything we can give them." Clara established new routines designed around Scout's changing needs and capabilities. Their morning walks became shorter and slower, but she discovered that Scout seemed to appreciate the leisurely pace, taking more time to investigate interesting scents and resting frequently in sunny spots along the trail. She invested in a heated bed for his shelter, though he increasingly chose to spend nights inside the cottage, curled on a soft blanket beside Clara's bed. His favorite tennis ball Once the catalyst for energetic games of fetch became a treasured comfort object that Scout carried with him from place to place. The ball was worn smooth by years of play. Its bright yellow color faded to pale cream, but Scout treated it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. Clara began documenting everything about Scout's daily routine, taking photographs and writing detailed observations about his preferences and habits. Part of her wanted to capture every remaining moment with him, to create a record that would help her remember the details of their life together after he was gone. But she also recognized a deeper impulse, the same protective instinct that had driven her to build his first shelter was now compelling her to create a monument to their relationship in words and images. Dr. Morrison visited more frequently now, his examinations gentle but thorough. Clara appreciated his honesty about Scout's condition while respecting his refusal to push for decisions before they became necessary. "You'll know when it's time," he assured her during one of these visits. "Scout will tell you, and you'll understand what he's asking for." As November arrived, the same month when Clara had first found Scout 14 years earlier, she began to sense changes in him that went beyond the physical. He spent longer periods gazing out the cottage windows, as if watching for something, or someone only he could see. Sometimes she would find him standing motionless in the woods, his attention focused on sounds or scents that remained mysteries to her human senses. Their conversations, always a crucial part of their relationship, took on new depth and poignancy. Clara found herself sharing memories of their years together, recounting adventures and quiet moments that had shaped both their lives. Scout listened with the same patient attention he had always given her words, but now his responses seemed weighted with significance, as if he too understood that their time was growing short. "Do you remember the first winter after I found you?" Clara asked one evening as they sat together beside the fireplace. "You were so suspicious of the snow, like you couldn't figure out what this cold white stuff was supposed to be, but by spring you were rolling in every patch you could find." Scout's tail moved in a gentle acknowledgement, and Clara felt tears threaten as she realized how many seasons they had shared, how many changes they had weathered together. The most difficult aspect of these final months was reconciling her grief about losing Scout with her gratitude for having had him at all. Every day brought small losses, a favorite walking route that became too challenging for him, a game he could no longer play, a comfortable position he could no longer maintain. But every day also brought moments of pure connection that reminded Clara why their relationship had been worth every sacrifice she had made to preserve it. One particularly clear morning in late November, Clara woke to find Scout standing by the back door, his body language conveying a request she immediately understood. He wanted to visit his original shelter, the small wooden structure that still stood in the clearing where their story had begun. The walk through the woods took nearly an hour, with frequent rest stops and careful navigation around obstacles. That would have posed no challenge in previous years, but Scout's determination to reach their destination was unmistakable, and Clara felt honored to accompany him on what she sensed might be a pilgrimage of sorts. When they reached the clearing, Scout settled beside his old shelter with a contentment that seemed to encompass their entire shared history. The structure had weathered 14 years of seasons but remained sound, its slanted roof still shedding rain effectively and its walls still providing protection from winter winds. Clara sat beside Scout, both of them quiet in the presence of so many memories. Here was where it had all started, her first real act of compassion, his first experience of human kindness after Sarah's death. Here was where they had learned to trust each other, to build something lasting from the materials of care and commitment. "Thank you," Clara whispered, not sure whether she was speaking to Scout, to the forest itself, or to the mysterious network of adults who had brought them together. "Thank you for everything." Scout's response was to rest his graying head on Clara's knee, a gesture of trust and affection that had remained constant throughout all the changes and challenges of their years together. In that moment, Clara felt the peace that comes from knowing that some gifts transcend their duration, that some love endures beyond the lives that first experienced it. They sat together in the clearing until the afternoon light began to fade, neither of them eager to break the spell of that sacred return to their beginning. Clara woke on the first Tuesday morning of December to an unusual silence in the cottage. For months she had grown accustomed to Scout's gentle movements in the early dawn hours, the soft padding of his paws as he shifted positions, the quiet sigh he made when settling back into sleep, the subtle sounds that signaled his presence even when he was resting. But this morning brought a stillness that made her heart clench with immediate awareness. She found Scout lying on his favorite blanket by the fireplace, breathing but with a labored quality that hadn't been there the night before. His eyes opened when she approached, and the look he gave her carried a weight of communication that transcended words. After 14 years of shared understanding, Clara recognized immediately what Scout was trying to tell her. "Is it time?" she whispered, settling beside him and placing her hand gently on his side. She could feel the effort each breath required, could see in his eyes the kind of weariness that comes not from physical exertion, but from the accumulated weight of living. Scout's tail made one small movement against the blanket, and Clara understood this to be his yes. After months of anticipating this moment, she felt surprising calm settle over her. The panic and denial she had expected were replaced by a deep sense of privilege. Scout was trusting her to help him with this final passage, just as she had trusted him to help her navigate every difficult transition in her own life. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her own understanding immediate and complete. "I'll call Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, and Clara felt grateful for her grandmother's practical wisdom and gentle strength. While they waited for the veterinarian to arrive, Clara gathered the things that had been most important to Scout throughout their years together. His worn tennis ball, faded now to the color of cream, but still treasured, the hand-knitted blanket Margaret had made specifically for his comfort, a photograph from their early years that Clara kept on her bedside table, showing both of them young and carefree beside the creek. But most importantly, Clara simply stayed present with Scout, her hand resting on his side, where he could feel her touch, her voice offering the kind of gentle conversation that had been the foundation of their relationship from the beginning. "Do you remember that first winter when you were so suspicious of the snow?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow. "You spent the whole morning just staring at it like you couldn't figure out what it was supposed to be. But by afternoon, you were rolling in it like you'd been waiting your whole life for something that cold and white and perfect." Scout's breathing remained labored but steady, and Clara could see him listening with the same attention he had always given her words. She continued sharing memories, each one a gift they could revisit together one final time. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, his manner both professional and deeply compassionate. He examined Scout with gentle thoroughness, confirming what Clara already knew in her heart. "His kidneys are shutting down, and his heart is working much too hard," Dr. Morrison explained quietly. "He's not in acute pain, but he's telling you that he's ready to go. In my experience, dogs this connected to their people usually wait until they know their person is ready too." Clara looked into Scout's eyes, seeing there the same trust and love that had anchored her life for 14 years. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I'm ready to help you with this, just like you've helped me with everything else." Margaret had prepared Scout's favorite spot by the living room windows, where afternoon sunlight streamed across the old wooden floors, and the view extended into the woods they had explored together for so many years. Clara settled beside Scout, his head resting in her lap, while Dr. Morrison prepared the medications with quiet efficiency. "You've been the best friend anyone could ask for," Clara whispered, her fingers stroking the soft fur behind Scout's ears. "You taught me how to love completely, how to be loyal, how to be present." You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I will carry everything you taught me for the rest of my life." Scout's eyes remained fixed on Clara's face, their brown depths holding the accumulated wisdom of 14 years of devotion. Dr. Morrison worked with quiet reverence, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, the completion of a bond that had shaped two lives in ways that extended far beyond their years together. "Sarah would be so grateful," Clara said, softly, speaking the name of Scout's first child for the first time since learning about her. "She would be grateful that you found me, that you had more love to give after losing her. You honored her memory by loving me so completely." The first injection brought immediate relaxation to Scout's labored breathing. His body settled more deeply into Clara's lap, but his gaze never wavered from her face. Clara felt the profound intimacy of being chosen as the last person he would see, the final voice he would hear, the hands that would guide him into whatever came next. "It's okay to go," Clara whispered, her tears falling freely now, but her voice remaining steady. "You've done everything perfectly. You can rest now." The second injection came, with Dr. Morrison's gentle explanation that Scout would simply fall asleep, that there would be no pain or struggle, only peace. Clara watched Scout's eyes grow heavy. But even as consciousness faded, she could see him fighting to maintain their connection for a few more precious seconds. "I love you," Clara said, the words carrying 14 years of gratitude and devotion. "I will always love you. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for everything." Scout's breathing grew shallow, then stopped altogether, with a gentleness that matched everything else about his character. His body remained warm in Clara's arms, but she could feel the essential Scout, his spirit, his personality, his boundless capacity for love, departing like warmth, leaving a room when a fire dies down. The cottage fell into profound silence, broken only by Clara's quiet weeping and the soft ticking of the mantel clock that had counted the hours of their life together. Dr. Morrison waited respectfully, allowing Clara all the time she needed to say goodbye to the physical presence that had been her anchor for so many years. Margaret appeared with the hand-knitted blanket she had created years earlier specifically for this moment, wrapping Scout's still form with the same tenderness she had shown him in life. Clara felt immensely grateful for her grandmother's foresight, for understanding that even this final transition could be softened by preparations made with love. As the afternoon light faded through the cottage windows, Clara remained beside Scout, her hand resting on the blanket that covered him. The cottage felt different already, emptier in ways that went beyond his physical absence. For 14 years, Scout's presence had been the invisible foundation that made this place feel like home. Now, Clara would have to learn how to inhabit these rooms and woods without the companion who had given them all their meaning. But even in the depths of her grief, Clara felt something she hadn't expected, a profound sense of completion. She had kept every promise she had ever made to Scout. She had been present for his final moments, had helped him die with the same dignity he had brought to living, had honored the trust he had placed in her from that first November morning when she found him shivering beneath a fallen log. The relationship that had begun with Clara's simple act of building shelter had ended with her providing the ultimate shelter, safe passage from life into whatever mystery came next. In learning to love Scout completely, Clara had discovered who she was meant to become, and that discovery would outlast even the grief that now threatened to overwhelm her. The 3 days following Scout's death passed in a strange suspension of normal time, each hour stretching like taffy while entire afternoons seemed to disappear without Clara's awareness. She moved through the cottage like a ghost, performing necessary tasks with mechanical precision while her heart struggled to accept the reality of Scout's absence. Margaret and Henry provided gentle support without overwhelming Clara with their concern, understanding instinctively that some grief required solitude to be properly honored. They kept the house running, prepared quiet meals that Clara picked at without tasting, and offered their presence without demanding conversation when Clara wasn't ready to speak. On Thursday morning, Clara woke with sudden clarity about what needed to happen next. Scout deserved a memorial that honored the magnitude of his impact on her life, and she deserved the ritual of creating something permanent to mark their relationship. She found Henry in his workshop, where he had been, quietly building what she realized was a small wooden casket, perfectly sized and lovingly crafted. "I want to bury him near his shelter," Clara said without preamble. "In the clearing where I first found him. That's where our story began, and that's where it should end." Henry nodded, his weathered hands continuing to sand the smooth pine boards. "I thought you might feel that way. I've been working on this since Tuesday. Figured Scout deserved something properly made, with care." Clara felt tears threaten again at her grandfather's thoughtfulness, but they were tears of gratitude rather than pure sorrow. Here was another example of the quiet love that had surrounded her entire life, the way the adults who cared about her understood her needs even when she couldn't articulate them herself. That afternoon, they carried Scout to the clearing in the casket Henry had built, wrapped in Margaret's hand-knitted blanket, along with his favorite tennis ball and a letter Clara had written during the long hours since his death. The letter contained everything she hadn't been able to say while he was alive: her gratitude for his unwavering loyalty, her amazement at the depth of love he had shown her, her promise to carry his lessons forward into whatever came next in her life. The burial spot Clara chose was just steps away from Scout's original shelter, in a patch of ground where wildflowers bloomed each spring and where the afternoon sun created a natural spotlight through the canopy of leaves. Henry had brought a proper shovel, but Clara insisted on digging the grave herself, needing the physical ritual of preparation. As she worked, Clara found herself remembering not Scout's final days, but his moments of greatest joy. The way he bounded through snowdrifts, his excitement when she returned from college visits, the contentment on his face when he stretched out in sunny meadows during their woodland walks. These memories felt like gifts Scout had left her, moments of pure happiness that would remain vivid long after the pain of losing him had softened. Margaret appeared at the edge of the clearing, carrying a small wooden box Clara recognized as her old childhood treasure chest. Inside, Clara discovered, were all the river stones she and Scout had collected during their years of exploration, each one labeled with a date and location in Clara's childhood handwriting. "I thought you might want to bury some of these with him," Margaret said gently, "a reminder of all the places you explored together." Clara selected the first stone they had ever collected, a heart-shaped piece of granite from the creek bank where Scout had learned to trust her completely. She placed it in the casket beside his tennis ball, a tangible symbol of the adventures that had defined their relationship. After Scout was buried and Clara had placed a temporary wooden marker at the head of his grave, the three humans stood, together in respectful silence. Clara felt simultaneously empty and full, empty of Scout's presence, but full of 14 years' worth of memories that would never leave her. "He had a good life," Henry said finally, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood what constituted genuine happiness. "From what you've told us about Sarah, and from what we've seen with you, that dog knew how to love and be loved completely. Not everyone gets that gift." Over the following weeks, Clara began the slow process of learning how to live without Scout's daily presence while maintaining her connection to everything he had taught her. She created a memory box from an old wooden crate, filling it with photographs, his collar, and written memories of their most meaningful moments together, but more. Importantly, Clara began to understand that Scout's influence on her life would continue in ways that went beyond memory and grief. He had shaped her capacity for loyalty, her understanding of unconditional love, and her appreciation for the profound connections that make life meaningful. These lessons would inform every relationship she formed and every decision she made. For the rest of her life, the cottage felt different without Scout, quieter and somehow larger, as if his absence had created space that Clara wasn't sure how to fill. But it didn't feel empty. It felt like a place where something important had happened, where love had been perfected through years of daily practice, where the essential lessons of living had been learned through the patient teaching of a dog, who understood better than most humans what devotion actually meant. 30 years after Scout's death, Clara Mitchell-Stevens stood once again at the edge of the clearing, where her life's most important relationship had begun and ended. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own instincts about what mattered most, but her eyes still held the same gentle intensity that had driven her to build a shelter for a frightened dog when she was just 8 years old. The cottage belonged to Clara now, willed to her after her grandparents' peaceful deaths within 6 months of each other. She had never left the county, instead building a life that honored everything Scout had taught her about loyalty, presence, and the profound meaning found in simple acts of devotion. Her career in veterinary social work had grown from those early days at the Animal Welfare Office into something much larger and more significant. Clara had developed programs that connected rescued animals with children who needed the same kind of unconditional love that Scout had provided during her parents' divorce. She had written articles about the healing power of human-animal bonds, consulted with therapists who used animal-assisted interventions, and quietly influenced a generation of children to understand that some relationships transcend the traditional boundaries between species. Her marriage to Daniel, a fellow veterinarian she had met during graduate school, had been built on shared values rather than shared dreams of conventional success. Daniel understood immediately that Clara's connection to this place and these woods was non-negotiable, and he had embraced the cottage and its surrounding forest as his own sanctuary. Their daughter Emma, now 22 and recently graduated from college herself, had grown up hearing stories about Scout and learning to see her mother's devotion to rescued animals as normal rather than excessive. But it was Emma's departure, for her first real job in another state, that had brought Clara back to this clearing with fresh understanding of the cycles of love and loss that define a meaningful life. Standing beside Scout's grave, now marked with a proper stone monument that read simply, "Scout, beloved friend and teacher," Clara felt the same mixture of grief and gratitude that had surrounded his death 3 decades earlier. The original shelter still stood, weathered but intact, its slanted roof continuing to shed rain effectively after more than 40 years. Clara had maintained it carefully over the decades, replacing boards when necessary and ensuring that its basic structure remained sound. She had never been entirely sure why preserving Scout's first home felt so important, but something deep in her spirit insisted that some monuments were too significant to let decay. Today, however, Clara had come to the clearing with a specific purpose. Using materials from Henry's old workshop and skills learned from years of maintaining the cottage property, she was building a second shelter beside the first. This new structure matched Scout's original home in size and design, but its fresh wood and clean lines marked it as something created in the present rather than preserved from the past. As she worked, Clara found herself narrating her activities in the same gentle voice she had used with Scout during the construction of his first shelter. "See how the roof angles to shed water, boy, and the raised floor will keep everything dry even when the autumn rains come hard." The voice she heard responding existed only in memory, but Clara could imagine Scout's tail wagging approval of her craftsmanship and her continued commitment to providing shelter for those who needed it most. Emma arrived as Clara was finishing. The roof, her young face showing the same mixture of concern and understanding that Margaret had shown during Clara's childhood crises. She had driven 4 hours from her new apartment to spend the weekend at the cottage, sensing somehow that her mother needed company during this transition. "It's beautiful, Mom," Emma said, settling beside Clara to examine the new shelter. "But what's it for?" Clara smiled, recognizing in her daughter's question the same practical concern that had always balanced her own romantic tendencies. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe for another dog who needs a safe place to heal. Maybe for some other kind of creature who needs protection. Maybe just as a reminder that building shelter is sometimes the most important thing we can do, even when we don't know exactly who we're building it for." Emma nodded with the serious attention she had inherited from both her parents. At 22, she possessed the same gentle strength that had driven Clara to rescue Scout, and Clara felt confident that whatever path Emma chose, it would be guided by the same values of compassion and loyalty that had shaped her own life. As the afternoon light began to fade, Clara placed a bouquet of wildflowers beside Scout's headstone and sat quietly with Emma in the shadow of both shelters. The woods around them hummed with the subtle sounds of late summer: bird calls, rustling, leaves, the distant murmur of the creek where she and Scout had spent so many peaceful hours. "Do you think he knows?" Emma asked quietly. "About everything you've done since he died, about all the animals you've helped, and the children you've connected with their own special dogs?" Clara considered the question with the same seriousness. She had brought to all of Emma's childhood inquiries about life's deeper mysteries. "I think love creates ripples that extend much farther than we can see," she said finally. "Every child who finds their own Scout, every rescued animal who discovers they can trust humans again, every act of kindness that grows from the seeds Scout planted in my heart. I think all of that is connected to what happened in this clearing when I was 8 years old." As they walked back through the familiar forest paths toward the cottage, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that comes from keeping long-held promises. She had honored Scout's memory not just through grief and remembrance, but through a life lived according to the principles he had taught her. The little girl who had built a shelter with her small hands and boundless determination had grown into a woman who understood that some acts of compassion echo across generations, creating shelter for hearts that haven't even been broken yet. The cottage lights glowed warm and welcoming as they emerged from the woods, and Clara felt Scout's presence as clearly as she had during those precious 14 years when he had been her constant companion. He was still teaching her, still guiding her understanding of what it meant to love completely and build something lasting from the simple materials of care and commitment. Some gifts, Clara understood now, are too precious to be limited by the lifespans of those who first give and receive them. Some love is designed to multiply across time, creating shelter for generations of hearts that need protection, guidance, and the transformative power of unconditional devotion.